So the lateral concept is there's an awful lot of pipe in the field. It's either buried or it's above ground. There are certain things you need to be concerned about when you have all that tube out there, and one of them is rodents. You have a very high potential for rodent damage if you don't have rodent control, and gophers just love the stuff. They'll just chew it up like candy. Mice will chew on it, and they just make holes in it, and then when that happens you got to go out and patch it. So there is a certain amount of maintenance that's required in a drip system.
So is there any other way to tell that when something's chewed through it other than it's just really wet there?
Yeah, to know if there's a problem in the field, a couple of things can happen. Number one, there'll be a wet spot in the field, and they really do stand out. You have to monitor these things on a regular basis. You drive the field and monitor it. Another thing is you'll start having pressure drop. Even in the drip system, you have an open pipe somewhere, the pressure in that loop's going to drop because you're pushing more water through the valve, you're getting more friction loss, and it drops the pressure. So if you're monitoring your pressures, you would know that as well. Most systems are not that sophisticated. Most of them are just counting on visual occurrence in the field. And if it's buried, it's a lot harder to find than if it's on surface. If it's on surface, it's pretty obvious. You can see it happening. If it's buried, you just start getting a bigger and bigger wet spot, and then a puddle starts showing. Then you know you got a problem. A lot of drip on asparagus in this part of the world. And there's a crop that's real great for gophers. So you have to have a real effective gopher campaign to keep those critters out of the field. Interesting thing that happens on surface drip is out here in the orchards and the cottonwood trees, they have trouble with coyotes. Last thing you would dream of is out here on these lateral lines, surface laterals, those coyotes. Well, they know they can get a drink of water. That water's dripping out of the hose, so they just go bite the hose, and they got themselves a little drinking fountain. And they get a little drink of water, and then just like a domestic dog, coyotes very similar, they like to play with it. Then they'll grab it and start tugging it around, and pretty soon they got the stuff scattered all over Timbuktu. And so there's a little predator control that they have to run out around the perimeters of a lot of these fields where they're matching up with the desert. And they actually hire predator hunters to patrol the big orchards and cottonwood blocks out there. It's a common practice. They hire guys to go out and shoot coyotes. So there's a job too, you know. That's an auxiliary job to being, you could be irrigator by day, predator control by night type of a deal. I've actually seen it happen, and it is really bizarre. See a coyote out there just tugging away on the drip and biting the pipe and lapping on the water and then dragging it around, and it really irritates the farmer. I mean, they hate those coyotes. It's incredible how much rage a man can have over a beast, but it does happen. It's kind of fun. It's kind of funny when I watched it happen. Both watching the coyote and then watching the farmer go berserk. He didn't have a gun with him, otherwise he'd have been shooting holes through everything. He is so mad. One last thing on drip that we have to be concerned about is the topography. Elevation. Up and down hills as we send that lateral and also the main line and the manifolds as well out through the system. So oftentimes we have to put some kind of pressure regulation on each of the manifolds or even each of the laterals. In many cases you will find a pressure regulator on the front end of every lateral in a drip system. Because generally what they try to do is run the laterals as flat as possible and let the rolling effects occur down the manifold or down the main line, if at all possible. So they're running the main line and manifold up and downhill, the laterals on the contour, across the face of the hill. That's ideal in many conditions. Or to run the lateral straight down the hill. You never want to run the lateral uphill. Because of the friction loss in the lateral plus the elevation differential, you have way greater pressure on the low end side than you do on the up end side. And therefore you have way more flow on the downhill side than you do the up end side. Now if you're starting at the main line manifold and going downhill with the lateral, then ideally you can set that out so that the pressure drop is equal to the friction loss, and you could get ideal representation of pressure to flow at every place down the pipe. That's an ideal. It doesn't happen too often in the field, but you always want to run your laterals either downhill or on the contour, never uphill, just because of the hydraulics of the system. Now we talked about types of emitters. You know, we have the kind that have pressure compensators in them, and if we do have hilly terrain, we have to go to pressure compensating emitters. They cost about twice as much money, and they do have a moving part, so that makes them more expensive and also makes them susceptible to failure more readily than a non-pressure compensating emitter, which would have effectively no moving part in it and would be able to be used on basically flat terrain where you have constant pressure and be less money in that process. Now we're going to look at pressure regulators, and we're going to look at some of the other concepts in another section of the class. And we'll see how those pressure regulators work when we get into the valve part of the class. Okay?